I'd like to introduce two more members of the Johns Hopkins team. First, Roland Griffiths, and then Mary Casamano will join us afterward. And after lunch, we'll have some more. It's a wonderful, powerful expression of what's going on at Johns Hopkins. But first, Roland Griffiths. Roland's going to talk about the Johns Hopkins Psilocybin Research Project, studies of the mystical experience, adverse effects, meditation in healthy volunteers, and palliative care in cancer patients, implications for spirituality and therapeutics. Dr. Griffiths, PhD, is professor of the departments of psychiatry and neurosciences at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. His principal research focus in both clinical and preclinical laboratories has been on the behavioral and subjective effects of mood-altering drugs. His research has been largely supported by grants from the NIH, and he's the author of over 360 journal articles and book chapters. He has been a consultant to the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and to numerous pharmaceutical companies in the development of new psychotropic drugs. He's also currently a member of the Expert Advisory Panel on Drug Dependence for the World Health Organization. He has conducted extensive research with sedative, hypnotics, caffeine, and novel mood-altering drugs. In 1999, he initiated a research program at Johns Hopkins investigating the effect of the classic hallucinogen psilocybin. That includes studies of psilocybin-occasioned mystical-type experiences in healthy volunteers. And as a note, I'm hoping that Roland will tell us a little bit about how the program at Johns Hopkins was initiated and how that came to be. Although I know it's not your topic for today. Mystical type experience in psilocybin-facilitated treatment of psychological distress in cancer patients, psilocybin-facilitated treatment of cigarette smoking cessation, psilocybin effects in beginning and long-term meditators and in clergy. The Hopkins Laboratory has also conducted a series of internet survey studies characterizing the effects of hallucinogen-occasioned mystical experiences, challenging experiences, near-death experiences, and effects on substance abuse. So please give me a warm welcome for Roland Griffiths, the director of the Johns Hopkins Psychedelic Research Program. Thank you.
Roland.
Thank you, Neil. So it's a great pleasure to be here today, and I just want to express my gratitude to Rick and Amanda and Bia for putting together this conference. So what I'm going to do is give you an overview of the Johns Hopkins Psilocybin Research Project, and I'm going to focus on the mystical type experience and its implications for spirituality and therapeutics. I've chopped out challenging experiences that was well covered by Derek May earlier, and I'll just briefly talk about our meditation, long-term meditator study, because Fred Barrett did such a good job with that. So I just want to acknowledge that support for this research has come from mostly the private sector, and in particular I'd like to note Hefter Research Institute provided a lot of support, and we also have had some support from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. These studies at Johns Hopkins are conducted on the Bayview Research Campus, and I just need to acknowledge our incredibly talented and dedicated research team. This just are the current present members of that research team, and 11 of the 12 are here at the meeting, and most of them are presenting data. So in some ways I'm redundant to to what people are presenting, and I'm certainly indebted to their incredible skillfulness in getting this research done. So we started the research project in 1999 at a time where we didn't know whether approval for such studies was even possible in drug-naive individuals. And so we've completed studies and have ongoing studies in psychedelic-naive healthy participants and experienced participants, novice and long-term meditators, in religious professionals, psychologically distressed cancer patients, addicted cigarette smokers. And I'm going to touch on all of these groups with the exceptions of the religious professionals. That's a study that's being done concurrently with NYU, and we've decided not to speak specifically about results until that study's completed. To date, we've treated almost 300 participants and 580 psilocybin sessions, so we've accrued a good deal of experience giving psilocybin under these supported laboratory conditions. I'm going to start just by reviewing our older work in healthy volunteers and tell you the results of that. That's going to be a review for many of you, but the basic rationale and the approach we use is identical to the other studies I'll be describing, so it just provides a good background and support. So we published 3 studies, 2006, 8, and 11, looking at psilocybin compared to methylphenidate and doing dose effects with those. And in those studies, as well as the other studies I'll describe, participants are recruited from the local community and sometimes outside that community, but in these studies in the local community. And they're medically, psychiatrically healthy. And in these studies, they were hallucinogen naive. And incidentally, I'm going to use hallucinogen and psychedelic interchangeably, so don't get thrown by that. In this first set of studies, this is collapsing across those three studies, mean age 46, about half female. This is a highly educated population and individuals that are performing at very significant professional levels generally, mostly employed. And participants in all of our studies meet with our guides or our session monitors for a number of hours, usually about 8 contact hours prior to the first session, and that's thought to reduce the chances of anxiety or adverse reactions with psilocybin. So the studies are conducted in a comfortable living room-like setting. People come in the morning. They take a capsule at about 9 o'clock. They're in the presence of 2 guides or monitors who are just there sitting in a supportive presence with them throughout their session. Volunteers are encouraged to lay on the couch, use eye shades and headphones through which they listen to a program of music. They're encouraged to direct their attention inward on their inner experience. So unlike some of the clips we've seen of the MDMA PTSD sessions in which there's dyadic interaction and therapy going on actively during the time of drug action. In these studies, we're just simply encouraging people to go in. The monitors, guides are there to provide reassurance if anxiety and fear arise. So this just shows the time course of monitor ratings of psilocybin effects in the dose effect study across the 6-hour session period. And you can see they're just very orderly dose and time-related effects, with effects peaking at 2 to 3 hours and then tapering off over sessions. And not surprisingly, when you give a high dose of psilocybin under these conditions, psilocybin produces the array of expected effects of classic psychedelics. So there are perceptual changes, greater emotionality, including sometimes fear and anxiety, and cognitive changes like a sense of meaning. But the feature that I want to focus in on today is that in most volunteers under these conditions, psilocybin produces large increases in scales that were specifically designed to measure naturally occurring mystical type experiences. And this shows post-session ratings of mystical experience from the dose effect study. So this is increasing doses from 5 to 30 milligrams per 70 kilogram of psilocybin, and you can see that there are robust increases in this. And the phenomenological dimensions of the mystical experiences have been reviewed in other presentations, include these: this sense of unity, core feature of it, the interconnectedness of all people, all things, pure consciousness, accompanied by a sense of sacredness or reverence, a noetic sense of encountering ultimate reality, or the experience being more real and more true than everyday waking consciousness. Deeply felt positive mood, transcendence of time and space, ineffability. Now, the effects of psilocybin dissipate by the end of the session day, but what's really remarkable is that the attributions made and the retrospective memories of these experiences endure and remain salient. So this slide just shows that about 80% of people a month after exposure to the high-dose sessions were saying that their experience was among the top 5 most personally meaningful and spiritually significant experiences of their lives, comparing it, say, to the birth of a firstborn child or death of a parent. About 90% are reporting increased sense of well-being or life satisfaction, and they're endorsing positive behavioral changes. As well, a month after sessions, participants attributing to the session experience positive changes in attitudes about life and self, mood changes, spirituality, and altruism and positive social effects. So this is just data on increased spirituality that is attributed to the psilocybin session. So people are reporting increased sense of reverence, sacredness in daily life, gratitude for life, interconnectedness with all of life, increased prayer, meditation, personal relationship with God, of their understanding, decreased apprehension about death. And these are the kinds of things that are endorsed about altruism and positive social effects, the increased sensitivity, tolerance, love, social concern for others, concern for vulnerable people, the need for service to others, decreased hatred, and negative expressions of anger. And that was a month after sessions. These effects are sustained. So the attributions to these experiences remain quite salient. We've gone up to 14 months, and we know anecdotally it goes far further than that. So the red bar shows 5 weeks after 20 or 30 milligrams per 70 kilogram. That first bar, that yellowish bar, is showing after placebo. So high rates of endorsement of well-being, life satisfaction, and then the blue bar is showing that those effects are sustained at 14 months. These effects aren't restricted just to volunteer reports. If we query family members, friends, colleagues at work, they also report that the participant has increased in the same positive kinds of domains, both 1 month follow-up and at 14 months follow-up. And then the final thing that I want to draw out of this initial set of studies was this relationship between the mystical experience score, how that was rated immediately after the session, and the long-term ratings of the spiritual significance of the experience. So on the left there, we see this relationship between the score on the mysticism scale that was rated immediately post-session and rating of spiritual significance at 14 months. So there's something that rating of mystical experience is capturing that predicts how people experience this 14 months later. And the graph on the right shows that relationship is not just intensity of the experience. It has something to do with the qualitative features of this experience. So this research that I've just described shows that psilocybin can produce these remarkable experiences to which people attribute positive changes in attitudes and behavior. What's not been shown clearly, and it's a little bit surprising given the anecdotal evidence, there's little evidence from prospective experimental studies in healthy volunteers of enduring changes in well-validated trait measures of disposition and personality. So it's a higher bar to clear, but there are good trait measure levels of have people changed. And in general, they don't change. And so it remains incumbent on us to find conditions under which we're producing maximal changes. And so this study was an attempt to do this. This is a study of psilocybin. This is unpublished, just ready to be submitted. So this is new data. And what we're looking at here is healthy volunteers, and we're examining whether or not we can produce enduring trait level changes. What we manipulated in this study is both psilocybin dose and intensity of support for engaging in meditation and other daily spiritual awareness practices. The difference of this study and the other studies, however, is that the psilocybin is being given in this background context where people are willing to engage in some of these other practices. And I think that's going to be the take-home here. 75 participants with little or no history of meditation or use of classic hallucinogens. So this was a 6-month study. It began with 1 month of meditation, followed by 2 psilocybin sessions separated by a month. Participants were randomized into one of 3 conditions of 25 volunteers each. This is a parallel group design. Participants and staff were blinded to dose and aspects of study design. So that group 1 received a low dose of psilocybin, just 1 milligram, and relatively low support for spiritual practices, 7 hours total. The second group has low support for spiritual practices, but received high doses of psilocybin, 20 on the first session, 30 on the second. And the third group received high doses of psilocybin and high support for spiritual practices. So they met repeatedly. There were 35 hours of both individual and group meetings. And again, I want to emphasize that there was a blindedness to this, so people did not know that there were 2 conditions. They knew they were getting psilocybin on each session. They were told to make the most out of these sessions. So there wasn't an immediate breaking of any blind, and we did things to, as best we could, confuse our guide monitors as to the design, which we did relatively successfully. So on session days, this is our mystical experience questionnaire score, and I'll show you a number of things with mystical experience. But this shows that the 2 high dose groups, the 2 lower bars, show much higher mystical experience post-session than the low dose group. So that just replicates what we had shown previously. So now I want to show you a series of outcomes at 6 months. And these are trait level measures showing effects. And this slide is prototypic. This is the daily spiritual experience scale showing the kind of results that we get. That little dotted line shows normative data based on general population. So you can see here that, and let me just explain the statistical notations. The stars indicate that group was significantly different from its own baseline, and the asterisks in this case indicate significant difference from the low-dose standard support group. So you can see the low-dose standard support group, in spite of making a commitment to do some meditation, but receiving very little support for that, it's really no different than the norms. And the next group is significantly different from that, and in turn, the high dose, high support and that's not statistically significant, but it's trending higher. And this is the general pattern we're going to see in all of these outcome measures. So here's a trait level measure of gratitude. This is life meaning, and in this case, the high dose, high support group is significantly different than both groups. Trait forgiveness, high dose, high support, again, higher than both groups. Forgiveness, this is another trait level measure of this pro-social forgiveness measure. Sanctification of strivings, these are ratings of life strivings as sacred or sacramental. Faith maturity scale, this is an alternative measure of spirituality in the perspectives and contexts of major faith traditions. This is an observer-rated measure of spirituality, a nice measure developed by Ralph Hood, measuring religious spiritual sentiments, showing the same basic outcomes. And here's our community observer-rated positive changes in mood and behavior, again, similar to what I showed you before. So these are all at 6 months. So this study in healthy participants provides the strongest demonstration to date that psilocybin can produce enduring positive changes in trait measures of prosocial attitudes and behavior and healthy psychological functioning. Psilocybin dose was a major determinant of this. High support for spiritual practice further increased the positive effects of high-dose psilocybin. And we did a regression analysis that shows that spiritual practices like meditation and mystical experience make independent contributions to these long-term outcomes, these trait-level changes. However, mystical experiences make the substantially greater contribution. So, switching gears, I'm going to go on now and talk very briefly about our study in long-term meditators. Fred Barrett just did a beautiful job of describing this in some detail, so he'll makes this this part of my presentation easy, and I can make it short. So there's little prior research investigating effects of psilocybin in long-term meditators. Of interest here is, do long-term meditators experience benefits or potentially harms from this kind of exposure? Psilocybin, and you're familiar, there's a fifth precept within Buddhist traditions anyway that, at least in some traditions, prohibit the use of what they call intoxicants. So there's a bias against using psychotropic drugs within some fields of meditation. So we think that psilocybin and meditation can be viewed as complementary techniques for the exploration of mind and self. And Fred went through some of that rationale. But they both focus on the nature of mind and self, and we think they provide that information in a very complementary fashion. And furthermore, there are neuroimaging data that suggests that long-term meditators and psilocybin are producing identical kinds of changes in default mode network processing responsible for self-referential processing. So this is a randomized placebo-controlled design. 40 participants with substantial meditation experienced little or no past hallucinogen use, 1 to 3 psilocybin sessions. Some sessions, participants engage in a series of different meditation sessions. Outcome measures include psychological functioning, spirituality, prosocial behavior, and fMRI imaging. I'm going to just focus on some of the subjective outcomes here. This is our mystical experience score, and this is showing group differences between a moderately high dose of psilocybin and placebo, and not surprisingly, perhaps, but in meditators, notably, we're seeing these large effects on mystical type experiences. This shows some of the attributions that people are making to these experiences, and again, concordant with our results in healthy volunteers. People are reporting large increases in the level of spiritual significance, personal meaning, increased life satisfaction. The rates actually of endorsement of spiritual significant and personally meaningful in the top 5 is somewhat lower than what we see in our other populations, so that may represent a difference in this population that have spent literally thousands of hours in contemplative practice. And this is their attributions. The study's still ongoing, but this is a preliminary shot of attributions that they're making to their spiritual practices. So their positive effects on non-sitting awareness practices, that would be like mantra repetition or bringing awareness into mindfulness into day-to-day practice. Greater flexibility in their meditation practice, that would be more flexible at how they approach their meditation, how they hold their meditation, and some increases in positive sitting meditation practices. So, a conclusion here is that despite the decades of daily contemplative practice, psilocybin does produce personally valued experiences along with positive effects on meditation and daily awareness practices. I would add, emphatically actually, that although these experiences are valued, none of our volunteers would claim that psilocybin is a substitute for meditation, because meditation results in much greater day-to-day, moment-to-moment stability of awareness. Shifting gears now to some data from our survey studies. We've conducted a series of survey studies. Derek May presented some work on the challenging experience study. And we're indebted particularly to these earlier studies to Earth and Fire Arrowwood, who really helped promote awareness of these surveys to psychedelic users. In any case, these are large groups of individuals reporting their experience after ingesting psilocybin mushrooms. These surveys take a long time to complete. They're anonymous, they're not paid, so people have to be interested in completing this. One of these surveys focused on individuals who endorsed having had a profound and personally meaningful experience. Participants completed the survey on the basis of their single most profound and meaningful experience. And data from this survey, and the first version of this was done by Catherine McLean when she was with us. Data from this survey and follow-up surveys were used to develop and then later validate. Fred Barrett did some of the validation, this 4-factor structure of our mystical experience questionnaire. But what I want to do today is show you how the survey data compares to data obtained from our laboratory groups. So you can see the survey data. We had an N of about 1,600 people, laboratory studies about 125 people, and there are demographic differences as we might expect. So our laboratory study, the age of the volunteer is higher, 35 than 25. They're about equivalently gender segregated. Our group in the laboratory studies have higher education and much less, by design, past exposure to classic hallucinogens. In spite of those differences, here's mystical experience questionnaire. The red is showing laboratory administration of our highest dose. This is 30 milligrams per 70 kilogram in 125 people. The blue is showing the non-laboratory survey results. And recall, this isn't just this isn't a random sample. These are people who have chosen to complete this study on the basis of their single most profound and meaningful experience after taking psilocybin mushrooms. So they had to have already endorsed that they had a deeply profound kind of experience, and then we're asking them, tell us about your very best experience. And you can see mystical experience scores are really quite similar. These are attributions to the experience, again, spiritually significant, personally meaningful in top 5, or increased life satisfaction. So they're really quite similar. And so the conclusion here is that there are marked qualitative and quantitative similarities of enduring effects across these two populations, one being laboratory studies of high-dose administration to drug-naive individuals, and the other are survey studies of psychedelic experienced individuals rating their single most personally meaningful and profound experience after taking mushrooms. And this really, if you think about it, it goes to underscore that the screening, preparation, support, dosing procedures we use in the laboratory may be optimizing conditions for producing meaningful experiences. I mean, these are naive people. This is the first time that they get this dose, and they're scoring as high as experienced people telling us about their very best experience. Now, here's another survey that we're just working up. Ethan Hurwitz is actually presenting a more detailed presentation of this data in a poster session. This is a survey in which respondents were asked to endorse have they had an experience of encounter something that someone might call God, God of your understanding, higher power, ultimate reality, or an aspect or emissary of God, like an angel. And so people got into this survey by saying, yeah, I've had that experience. The interesting part of this survey is that there are two target populations. One who have had this kind of experience after having ingested psilocybin mushrooms, and another group who have had this experience in absence of taking a psychoactive drug. In fact, this non-drug group could never have taken a psychedelic. So we're comparing spontaneous reports, if you will, non-drug reports of God encounters with mushroom-occasioned experiences. And again, the demographics, this is the psilocybin groups, about 1,150 people, the non-drug groups, 829, and there are demographic differences as we might expect. So the non-drug group tends to be older, more female, better educated, higher income. So they're demographically very different. If you ask these people, what's your memory of this encounter? Tell us about the vividness of it, or was the experience more real than everyday reality? Both endorse these at very high rates, and in fact, the non-drug group endorses the reality question just somewhat higher, but very similar, vivid memories. And then interestingly, in terms of intention of the encounter, both groups endorse that at relatively low rates. Did you intend to encounter God prior to this experience? So these are largely unbidden experiences in both groups. Now here's where it gets interesting. So we asked them, well, what is the best descriptor of what it was that you encountered? You know, give a name to what it was. And that top set of graphs show that the non-drug group is endorsing at much higher rates, 60% rates, that they encountered God or an emissary of God. And in contrast, the psilocybin group is much more likely to endorse that what they encountered was ultimate reality. Okay, so they're demographically different. They have different descriptors for what they have encountered. And so now we ask them, well, tell us about the attributes of what it is you encountered. So was what you encountered, and we feed it back. So you said you encountered God. Was this God eternal? So this shows just a remarkable similarity of the attributes they attribute to this, and they're beautiful. In both cases, what they encountered, be it God or ultimate reality, was intelligent, it was sacred, it was benevolent, it was eternal, and it was conscious. And it wasn't malicious or negatively judgmental. So it's it's a name game here. Mystical experience scores in both groups are very high, as are the attributions to the experience. Again, the spiritual significance, personal meaning, psychological insight, increased life satisfaction. What happened to the atheists? Of course, there were some atheists in there. So identification as an atheist before the encounter was more common at about 20% in the psilocybin group than the non-drug group. But after the encounter, the majority of atheists in both groups no longer identified as atheists. So 64%, 74%. So psilocybin, and this really suggests that in effect these experiences are conversion experiences for atheists. So the conclusion from this God Encounter survey, these preliminary findings support the idea that psilocybin occasion experiences of encountering the divine, if you will, could represent a model system for understanding non-drug, so-called naturally occurring experiences, most often described as a personal encounter with God. So I now want to turn to two studies of dextromethorphan. Dextromethorphan is an NMDA antagonist. It's a dissociative psychedelic. Its use has increased substantially. It's a cough medicine available as Robitussin and Coricidin. But its use as a dissociative hallucinogen has increased in recent years. And the reason I want to show this data, these are two studies in drug experience groups, is because they really suggest the context-dependent determinants of the subjective perceptions of drug effects and underscores the continuing need for important, rigorous, double-blind procedures. And I want to show this because I'm haunted sometimes by my clinical colleagues that tell me, come on, Roland, we don't have to run another placebo-controlled design. This is really stupid, isn't it? We know what psilocybin does. Let's get on with doing the important stuff. And the point I want to make here is, in fact, if we're going to disentangle how these drugs truly work, there still is some kind of continuing need to have some blindedness, whether it's placebo-controlled or not, I don't know. But let me tell you about these two studies. So both studies use double-blind, counterbalanced designs, day-long sessions similar to what we've described for the other studies. Unlike our previous studies, participants in these studies had substantial psychedelic experiences with a range of psychedelic drugs, including dextromethorphan, DXM. Mean lifetime use of classic hallucinogens in this case was greater than 60 times. Now, participants in the study were instructed that they would receive placebo or doses of a wide variety of other drugs, from stimulants, hallucinogens, antihistamines, and the study staff, most of our study staff were also blinded to precise drug conditions. This was called the club drug study. Now, based on either our advertising or our consent form, participants and staff believed that a hallucinogen would be administered on at least one session. But that's all they knew about these 5 sessions. And so 2 or 5 sessions in the second study and more sessions than that in the first study. So the first study, what we did is compared triazolam, which is a classic sedative hypnotic, it's a sleeping pill, with a wide range of DXM doses and placebo. Second study, we were comparing 3 different dose levels of psilocybin, 10, 20, and 30 milligrams per 70 kilogram, with a high dose of dextromethorphan that we knew to be quite active from that first study. This shows precipitant-rated drug effects. And in the left there, this is the triazolam study, and you can see triazolam is producing dose-related increases in those drug effects, and dextromethorphan is also producing clear dose-related increases, the red symbols. And the right shows the psilocybin, so you can see there's psilocybin dose effects, and dextromethorphan is producing magnitude ratings of drug effects right on par with that produced by our high doses of psilocybin. And if you look at the mystical experience questionnaire, dextromethorphan is significantly increasing that in both studies. You can see in the dose effect study, it's increasing in a dose-dependent fashion. Triazolam does not touch mystical experience, so this isn't a generalized kind of phenomena. And psilocybin, as we would expect, is producing dose-related increases in that. So now we ask people at the end of the session, so categorize, what kind of drug class do you think you received today based on your experience with a wide variety of drugs? And so one question is, what do you think you received a sedative hypnotic today, like a sleeping pill? And you can see triazlam is identified pretty clearly and dose-dependently as a sedative. Dextromethorphan, psilocybin are not. But here's where it gets peculiar. Did you receive a classic hallucinogen like psilocybin or LSD? So in that first study, DXM is producing dose-related increases in identification as a classic hallucinogen. In the second study, in the context in which these people are receiving psilocybin, they do not identify it as a classic hallucinogen. But psilocybin across the board is clearly identified as a classic hallucinogen. And conversely, did you receive a dissociative hallucinogen? That first study, almost no one identified DXM as a dissociative hallucinogen because they were all identifying it as a classic hallucinogen. But in the second study, the rate of appropriate discrimination was made. So the contrasting results in this drug categorization data suggest the context-dependent determinants of perception of drug effects. And very likely the context here is giving, if you give dextromethorphan in the context of getting different doses of psilocybin, you're much less likely to identify it as a classic hallucinogen. There may be other factors at work. What it does is underscore this continuing importance for rigorous double-blind procedures and controlling for expectancy and context. And we're going to need to do this if we're going to meaningfully differentiate among the vast array of psychotropic drugs that we have that produce very interesting alterations of consciousness. And these results, too, raise questions about the veracity of commonly reported differences in the phenomenology between different substances. For example, the allegedly relatively high rates of serpent or jaguar imagery after ayahuasca administration, or, pointing the fingers at us, the high rates of mystical experience after psilocybin. So in my remaining time, I'm going to just turn to therapeutic applications. And we have 3 targets: depression, anxiety in cancer patients, cigarette smoking, and we're just within days of initiating a major depression trial. I'm going to focus mostly on the cancer data, which was published in December of this year. So the purpose of this study was to determine whether psilocybin had efficacy at moderate to high doses when administered to cancer patients who had significant anxiety or depression in face of a life-threatening cancer diagnosis. 51 participants, mean age 56, about half female, highly educated, mostly Caucasian. About 45% had histories of hallucinogen exposure, but on average 31 years ago. So these were people who might have had a dose of LSD in college, and 30 years later they're distressed and in cancer. Medical prognosis: most had recurrent or metastatic disease, 35% possibility of recurrence. Types of cancer were varied. We didn't control that at all. In terms of psychiatric diagnoses, there are SCID diagnoses, almost 40% depressed mood, 30% anxiety, 30% mixed anxiety and depression. 51% had prior medication treatment that had failed for treatment of anxiety or depression. This shows the design. It's a randomized, double-blind, crossover design to investigate the acute and sustained effects of a very low dose, essentially functioning as a placebo at 1 milligram per 70 kilogram, versus a moderately high dose, 22 milligrams per 70 kilogram. We had rather extensive and misleading blinding conditions in the study that were designed to minimize expectancy effects both on part of our staff and our volunteers. So people did not know that there were just two conditions to be assigned to. They knew that they'd received psilocybin on every session, as did the guides, and they were told to make the most they could out of each session. They participated a total of 9 months. 2 8-hour psilocybin sessions were scheduled about 5 weeks apart. In the order in which they received the high dose or the low dose was varied in a parallel group design. So one group got the high dose first, 5 weeks later there's follow-up, then the low dose, and then we did a 6-month follow-up. Second group, a reverse order. No serious adverse effects attributable to drug administration. 3 of our participants died prior to the 6-month follow-up due to their cancer. This is overall drug effects ratings similar to what we see in the healthy volunteers. In this case, we're getting stronger placebo effects because of the blinding conditions. Mystical experience scores were much higher in the higher dose group, and attribution of meaning, spiritual significant well-being, again, was much greater in the high dose than the low dose group. And that blue bar shows that these effects are sustained at 6 months. Again, very similar to what we've shown in the healthy volunteers. Now, bearing in on the measures we have of depression and anxiety, so the HAM-D is a gold standard clinician-rated measure of depression. And this is showing percentage of patients on the left showing clinically significant improvement. So clinically significant improvement on the HAM-D is a 50% drop in symptom scores. And you can see that 92% of people 5 weeks after the high dose, this is the orange bar, are showing clinically significant improvement over the green bar, and these effects are sustained out to 6 months. Drops just a little bit. In the right-hand column, right-hand panel, we see remission to normal range. So remission means that the symptom scores on the HAM-D have fallen within the range of the normal population, so these people would be considered not to be depressed at all. You can see we have 60% remission rates after 5 weeks after the high dose, and it's up to over 70% at 6 months. And this shows identical data for the HAM-A. This is a measure of anxiety and shows again the same pattern of results. It's really quite compelling that these results are sustained out to 6 months. And this shows this post-session mystical experience score as a predictor of therapeutic efficacy. So the 2 bottom panels show the results of anxiety and depression. There's a regression on mystical experience score. The top ones show personally meaningful and spiritually significant. So again, there's something that's being captured by this mystical experience scale that's predictive, in this case, of long-term positive outcomes, and in this case, therapeutic outcomes. So, conclusions from this study: a single moderate high dose of psilocybin, when administered under supportive conditions to carefully screen participants, can produce substantial and enduring decreases in anxiety and depression in cancer patients. And Steve Ross, Jeff Gus, and Tony Bassis, all of whom are here today from NYU, ran a very similar study. We co-published similar results. And so the next step in this series is that the USONA Research Institute has initiated a dialogue with the FDA, and we're exploring a phase 3 multi-site clinical trial to establish the therapeutic efficacy of psilocybin. Treatment of addiction. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's been exciting to be along that path and actually go to a meeting with FDA and start dialoguing about prospects for approval as a medication. So another target for us has been addiction. And Matt Johnson, after the lunch break, will be presenting the promising results from our pilot studies and the clinical trial and some survey data on this. The only point I want to make is as with the healthy volunteers and the cancer patients, there's a relationship here of mystical experience and predicting decreased craving long-term in cigarette smokers. This is from the pilot data in which Matt and Albert showed 80% abstinence rates at 6 months. But again, to go back to the point, there's something within that mystical experience score that's capturing something that's unique and important. So the overall conclusion then is that under these conditions of these studies, psilocybin discrete experiences have marked similarities to classic, naturally occurring mystical type experiences. These experiences are associated with enduring positive trait level changes in attitudes, moods, behavior, spirituality, and altruism. The implication here is that psilocybin can occasion, in most people studied, mystical type experiences virtually identical to those that occur naturally. I mean, that's the finding, that that there's a virtual identity between the type of experience occasioned. And it really suggests, therefore, that these experiences are biologically normal. That is, we're wired for these kinds of experiences. And that it also suggests, very importantly to science, that such experiences are amenable to systematic, prospective scientific study. And so there's something about these transformative experiences that's wired into our biological makeup. We've observed them periodically over time in naturally occurring mystical experiences, and now we can study them prospectively. And so there's just a wide range of really fascinating and important scientific research to do here. Biological psychiatry, how do factors such as personality, genetics, intention alter the likelihood of these experiences. In neuroscience, and Fred presented some of our interesting neuroscience data, and the Imperial group and Franz Bohlenweider group are doing fascinating neuroscience. What are the pharmacological neuronal pathways in brains that are responsible for such experiences? Behavioral sciences, what behaviors are changed after such experiences? What are the behavioral mechanisms that underlie these changes? And then, of course, the therapeutic applications. And, I mentioned addictions and cancer and depression, but there are many other targets that we're really interested in and hopeful for exploring. And then finally, spirituality and altruism. I think there's some profound implications there. So I personally have great optimism that future research will reveal these underlying biological neuroscience and behavioral mechanisms of actions. And I think further research is very likely to produce an array of novel treatment applications. But I think what I really want to underscore is that because these mystical experiences give rise to these trait-level changes in spirituality and altruism, gratitude, forgiveness, interpersonal closeness, they really appear to be foundational to our very deepest ethical and moral understandings, this pro-social impulse for mutual caretaking. And therefore, further research into the causes and consequences of these absolutely extraordinary experiences is very likely to be crucial ultimately to the very survival of our species. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. Come on. Thank you, Roland, so much. We have some time for questions, about 5 minutes, if you'd like to direct a question to Dr. Griffiths. Miss, come step right up here, please. First name.
Felina. Hi, good morning. Good afternoon, rather. This is Felina. Thank you so much. Thank you so much on behalf of all of us for the work that you've done. Could you give us a couple of guidelines as a community how we can be talking about this research and what you've seen over your extensive career in the medical community so as to facilitate it in the future? Thank you.
Well, what an interesting question. It's, we've experienced a demonization and a marginalization of these compounds from what happened in the 1960s. And so there's a process of rehabilitation of the validity of and the usefulness of these compounds. And there are two fronts. One is scientific. Our culture really values science, right or wrong. I think right, being a scientist. But so, as a community, if we underscore the fact that, these are more than anecdotes. This is raw science that are supporting the underpinnings of these kinds of changes, and that they truly are important. And the related vector for change is the therapeutic applications of this, and this is why, MAPS and Hefter and USONA are so dedicated to that. So I think it's emphasizing the validity of the science and the therapeutic applications, and frankly not minimizing the fact that there are adverse effects. I think we just have to recognize those. Derek did a good job of laying out our concerns about those, but that would be it. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name's Andrew. I just want to thank you for your work. My question revolves around what kind of reaction you get from the primary care doctors of the cancer patients, and if they're positive or negative or neutral, and how you work with the primary care doctors of the cancer patients.
Yeah, thank you for this. That cancer study took almost 10 years to complete, and part of the problem there was getting referrals into the study. So at Hopkins we have a huge cancer center, but there remains a huge degree of skepticism about whether this is an appropriate way to treat people and to treat vulnerable people. So what I have to say is our experience has been really mixed with respect to primary docs or even people within our cancer center in terms of embracing this. We actually had to go far and wide. We recruited people in from out of state for our study. But again, things are changing. The press that was covered, the positive press that was covered with the release of the NYU and Hopkins study was really quite phenomenal. It was the most widely cited study out of Hopkins medicine for 2016, and that's saying a lot. The same was true of NYU. So things are changing, and we need to just support that culture of change. And so I expect hopefully by the time we get into phase 3 that we're going to have much better support from the community of physicians to refer people.
All right, thank you very much.
First name.
Hello, my name is Miguel, and I had a question in regards to how participants compared mystical and non-mystical, or rather drug-induced and non-drug-induced experiences, if they had any sort of subjective feelings towards one maybe not being real despite the fact that they had this mystical experience, like actually being something worthwhile that they would choose to continue with, or if some of the people say that were long-term meditators were like, cool, that was a great one-time little, pick up, but now I'm just going to keep on doing my general meditation, and vice versa, people that, yeah.
So are you asking about the long-term meditators and?
Or rather, just I guess there's multiple studies, but have you seen within your research people comparing them in terms of like, yeah, that's actually like a really good thing. I'm glad I was doing it, and I'm going to continue to do it. Or hey, that's a cool thing, but that was a good one-time little experience.
Yeah, well, I mean, by and large, the data is pointing to people finding these experiences remarkable. They're endorsing them to be among the most personally and spiritually meaningful experiences of their lives, bar none. And that seems to occur in the healthy volunteers, the cancer patients, the long-term meditators. And stay tuned for the religious professionals, but you might take a guess.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Please help me thank Roland Griffiths. Roland, the remarkable Roland Griffiths.